get started. So I was running a little late this morning. So we're going to pick up where we left off on HTML elements. Well, not pick up where we left off. We finished the last lecture, but we're going to continue looking at some HTML elements. Going to keep digging into those, and then I'll probably do a little bit of demonstration after the lecture, and then don't forget we have a quiz Thursday on everything up till now, as well as your assignment 2 being due on Thursday, and we'll go over assignment 3 on Thursday as well. So, all right, let's get started. Okay, so first let's talk about images. So obviously an important part of websites. We've talked so far a lot about text elements. So different elements that can only contain text, that are kind of ways to add structure and some meaning to our text. So now we're going to look at how to add images to our HTML. So we use the image element to include images, just img. It's an empty element, so as we've discussed before, empty elements don't have any content inside them. They also don't have an opening and closing tag. There's just one tag that contains all the information. So an image element is one of those empty elements. It has a required source attribute, which gives the URL to the image. So you do like source equals and then provide a URL. It can be relative or absolute. So you can put in, HTTP whatever website / file name, or it can just be a file name or just a path if it's a image that's within your own file structure on your website. There's also a required attribute of alt, which provides a text description of the image. This is really, really important, and it's often left out, but it is required technically by the HTML specification, and it's really highly recommended to use. So it's used primarily for screen readers. So screen readers, they can't visually see the image, but assuming that the image is important, which usually they are, you need to provide some sort of information about what that image is to your screen readers. Otherwise, they'll just see that there's an image there and they'll not, have any information about it. It's also important if the image is no longer accessible. So that's happened a bunch, even on websites I've worked on where, if you load an image, especially from an external domain, or even from your own website, and then someone later accidentally deletes that file, that image will no longer show up. If you have an alt attribute, the text that's in your alt attribute will show up where the image would have been if the image doesn't load. So very important, if you have an image of a product or something like that, you want to put inside that alt attribute a description of the image so that if the image doesn't load for some reason, the user still kind of gets some information about what's supposed to be there. So that's pretty important. You can leave it empty if the graphic is just decorative. So if there's no meaning to the graphic, if it's like a divider line or a background texture, something like that. If it's purely decorative, you can leave the alt attribute empty. I still recommend putting the alt attribute there and just leaving it empty. Some people will even say decoration inside the alt attribute. That's also acceptable. But you need to at least have the alt attribute there, but it can't be empty if there truly is no meaning to your image. There's an optional attribute of title, which provides a tooltip on mouse hover. So you can use that to give a title to your image, and when the user hovers over the image, it'll kind of pop up as a tooltip and provide whatever your title was. Again, it's optional. People don't necessarily hover over images all the time, but it can be useful if you want to provide some additional information about your image. You can also use figure and fig caption, which we talked about, which are semantic elements that can wrap an image and give it a caption. So that's a good way, quite often when we put images, we want some sort of caption to go along with it. Wrapping that with figure, so figure wraps the whole thing. You'd have your image, and then you'd have fig caption after your image that would wrap, a paragraph or a heading or even just some text that kind of gives a caption. So the nice part about doing it that way is that you can then position your entire figure so you're moving the image and the text that goes along with it all together. You don't have to make sure they line up, and then move them independently. You kind of get them as one element. Any questions about images? Okay, so here's an example. So first we've got just a regular image tag. Again, we've got our source. This would be a relative URL to an image within an images folder. So that's really common, especially if you're going to have more than one image. Create a folder called images to hold all of your images, just to kind of keep your file structure a little bit cleaner. So we're loading it from that folder. We've got an alt that says bird picture, so it's just providing some information. Really should probably say what kind of bird it is, or something a little more descriptive. Whatever is important that the user understands from the image is what you should put in your alt. So be as descriptive as you need to be. We've also got a title, which again is optional. Again, this is a self-closing tag, so it's just got the slash in the closing bracket. It doesn't have a closing tag along with it. Here's an example of using a figure. This is really common because, again, a lot of times we want to have a caption along with our image. So we've got a figure, the image. Here's one example where using a break tag is okay, because fig caption by default is going to be inline as well as the image. So without that break tag in there, the caption will start on the same line as the image. That's probably not what you're going to want. You're probably going to want to pop it down to a new line. So that's an acceptable use of a break tag. You could also do it with CSS and not have the break tag, but if you have to use a break tag, that's fine. And then we've got our caption. There's just some text that goes along with that. And then we can style our caption however we want, change the font, change the background color, whatever. But we can move this entire figure as one element with the image and the caption. Think of like a textbook, it'll have an image with a caption, and it might be floated left or floated right or something like that. It's a lot easier to handle it when it's just one element. Okay, there's a height and width attribute, which you can use to constrain the size of the image in pixels. This is pretty important to use. Often the image will take longer to load than the rest of your page, so images are just going to be a little bit larger file sizes usually than just your HTML. Your HTML is just text. It's going to load pretty quick. But so your browser, renders the HTML, and then it goes and looks at any resources it needs to also download to display on the page, which would be your images, your CSS, etc. The images usually take longer than the rest of your page. So if you use height and width to kind of say what the dimensions of your image are, it will save empty space for that image while it loads. So it's really important. It'll kind of prevent a page jump. So you've probably experienced this. Sometimes when you go to a website, like it loads, you'll start reading something, all of a sudden everything jumps down. It's because an image loaded. Once that image loaded, it'll insert it into the page. It'll move the rest of your content down. It happens a lot with ads. It won't save space for it until it loads, and then it jumps it down. So providing a height and width attribute is really a helpful way to say, this is the space the image takes, and then your browser by default will leave that empty space there. So once it loads, it just takes up that space. It doesn't move your content around or create any sort of erratic behavior. It's really useful to do. You can also specify the image size with CSS as well. To help your site load faster, you should also resize the image to the proper size. So again, use something like Pixlr or Photoshop if you have it to actually change the size of the image. A really common problem I see with websites is you'll have, like say you use a DSLR or something to take some photos, or even just download a high quality photo off the internet. It's going to be a massive file, right? It's a huge photo. It might be, 2,000 pixels by 2,000 pixels or something. It's really big. You can use height and width to constrain that. Say it's just a thumbnail, so it's just like your profile photo, so it's only 200 pixels by 200 pixels, but in reality that image is massive, and it's also going to take a long time to download, and there's no need to have all of that detail for just a small image. So you should resize your images using an actual image editor to the appropriate size, rather than just relying on height and width. Height and width is providing the browser information about the size of the image, but you should make sure your actual image size reflects that as well, because it's going to load a lot faster. That's the number one thing I do. One of the things I'll do, freelance for companies is help their websites load faster. And so I worked with a company back in the fall that they're like, hey, our site's really, really slow. You know, we paid these guys to make this site for us, and we really like it. It's awesome, but it's super slow. Can you help us? And I spent like an hour just resizing all their images. They had tons of images. It was a cool site. They had like big, full width types of images, but they were all like 2 MB. And I was like, and they were even sort of like background images with like gradient over them. So they didn't even need to be that high resolution. You could, with the gradient, you could get away with dropping the quality. So I think I reduced their overall page size. It was something like 12 MB, and I brought it down to like 250 kilobytes or something. And so it went from loading in 10 seconds to in like 1 second. And they were amazed. They're like, Kraig, you're amazing. This is so cool. And I was like, yeah, I spent an hour and all I did was resize your images and save them as JPEGs with like 50% compression. And it looks exactly the same on the site. You can't tell any difference, but it loads so much faster. So really, really important that you consider your image size. That's the #1 problem that makes websites load really slowly. Okay, image format. So as you probably know, there's several different formats that your images can be saved in. These are the 3 main ones supported by browsers. So if you're using a format, you can't have like a raw image or something like that. The browser won't know what to do with it. But these are the 3 formats we can use on websites. So first is PNG, which is pretty useful. It supports transparency, which is really nice. It's generally going to be a little bit larger file sizes, though. It is, compressed a little bit, but it's a high quality. So if you have like a really high quality image, it's good to use, but it's generally going to have larger file sizes. But if you need transparency, you pretty much have to use PNG. JPEG, which can be .jpeg or .jpg. Doesn't have transparency, so you can't have, a transparent background. It's best for photographs and images with lots of different colors. So just the compression algorithm that JPEG uses, it's kind of optimized for photographs or something that's really pixel dense, I guess, has lots of different colors in it. And it can compress for smaller file sizes. So JPEG is the best for compression. Definitely better than PNG. You can take JPEG. Usually when you save something as JPEG on a, good photo editor, you can adjust the quality with like a slider as a percentage. And generally you can go down to at least 80% quality without any real discernible difference. Usually you can go down to 50% or so if you're okay with it starting to look a little bit compressed. But JPEG's really, really great. GIF is also useful. It supports animation, so that's cool. So if you have anything, that's kind of a more common thing now. Obviously, I've seen a lot of like animated logos and stuff like that on websites. It can have limited transparency. You can do straight lines where they're transparent. It's kind of a strange limitation, so you don't often see transparency with GIFs, but you can do it. It just has to be straight lines. So I've seen it sometimes where it'll be like, half of the image or something will be transparent. Things like that. So it is possible, but it's a little bit harder to do. GIF is really good for illustrations or images with few colors. So again, just the compression algorithm that it uses. A lot of times you'll see with JPEG, if you have like a logo with like straight lines and just like one color, so many times I'll, save something as a JPEG, and what's a really clear, crisp straight line, JPEG will distort that line a little bit and add, kind of a gradient or something, whereas GIF will always maintain straight lines, or just anything that has a really clean design, something that's like a one-color logo or something like that. Almost always better to use GIF for that, whereas JPEG is best for photos, or just something with lots of different colors. So that's kind of the difference there. Typically, you want to use JPEG or GIF most of the time. PNG only if you really, really care about image quality or you absolutely need transparency. Any questions?
Does transparency means that background is transparent?
Yeah, correct. Yep. Yeah, so if you have, an image that's floating on top of another image and it moves around or something, you need some transparency there. Okay, let's talk about HTML tables. So tables allow you to create a grid of cells to display data or information. Very important, tables should not be used for creating a page layout. This is really common. It comes from, like, when I was in high school, I took a web design class, and we used tables for everything. So, like, our entire page was one big table. Because it does provide some, especially without getting into CSS, you can, just with your HTML, do some layout stuff with tables. You can make columns really wide, and you have a nice way to, put stuff in a column layout with using a table. But since we have CSS now, that's not the way to do things. So you absolutely should never use tables for doing like a sidebar or like a site navigation or menus. Your tables are only for displaying data. Really, really important. One of the big reasons this has come up is people are like, well, why? One of the reasons is for screen readers. So like a screen reader is going to read a table and it's expecting tabular data, right? It's expecting, something that has some data in it. But if you're using a table for your page layout, that's not really tabular data. You're kind of subverting what it's supposed to be used for. And there's better ways to do your page layout than tables anyway. So again, using tables for page layout is a really old practice that we don't need to do anymore. So if you use tables for your page layout, if you have anything more than just data inside your table, that's not good. You can have like links and or even images maybe, but it should be something that needs to be a table, not just using it for layout purposes. It's really, really important. So our table structure. So we use a table element to create a table. Pretty self-explanatory. We use TR, which stands for table row, to create a row within our table. TH will create a table cell within the current row that contains a row or a column heading. It's a little bit confusing. I'll show an example here in a minute, but TH is used for cells that should be heading cells. So, you think of a table, your heading can either be, all along the top, so like your first row is your heading, and then your, table data is below that, or sometimes you have the first column is the heading, and the content is after that in the following column. So it's kind of up to you. So you can use TH either way to create heading cells. Browsers typically will style table headings, so TH elements, as bold and centered. So usually the headings of tables, you want centered and you want bold so they stand out. Again, we can change that with CSS, but that's usually the default. TD creates a table cell within the current row that is just a regular regular cell. So you don't have to have TH elements in your table. It's just if you want a heading, row, or column. But TD creates just a normal cell. A row can have multiple TD elements to create columns. So if you have a TR and then you have 5 TDs within that TR, the TR creates your row, and then each TD creates a column within that row. There's a call span attribute you can use, which will cause a cell to span multiple columns. So if you want a certain cell to span more than one column, you can use call span. Or there's row span attribute, which will cause a cell to span multiple rows. Not super common to use those, but there are instances where you might want to. Okay, I think I've got an example here in a second, but longer tables, you might also want a specific header, body, and footer element within your table. This is especially useful for anything that you're going to be doing some JavaScript or some interactivity with. So like a scrolling table. I've used this a couple of times for, different reports and stuff like that you'll write in HTML, for admin users or something. You might have a table and you want the heading and the footer to always be visible, but you've got a lot of data that you want the user to be able to scroll through. So you can actually make the header and the footer kind of static and have the body be 500 pixels tall, but scrollable, so they can scroll through all the data while the header and the footer is always there. So you can use T-head to wrap the header. So it would wrap any rows that are comprised of the header. T-body will wrap the body of your table, and T-foot will wrap the footer of your table. Again, rows would go inside of each of those elements. Those are all optional. You don't have to use those elements if you don't necessarily need to separate the footer or the body or the header through your HTML. You can, just use the TH elements. But that's really nice for some types of tables, that, especially if they get long, that's a good way to do it. By default, they're not styled differently. But again, you can use CSS to do that, or you can do some interaction, again, such as scrolling or sorting. So like you might want to make a table be sortable via JavaScript, but you want the header to always be at the top, right? So you can use your T-head to say, okay, this row is a header. The rest of the column or the rest of the rows can be sortable, but this one is always going to be static at the top. So, yeah, question.
So when you say wraps, do you mean that's the static part, or the makes it static?
I just mean wraps as in you would have your T-head, and then you'd have like a TR and a TD, then you close your TR, then you close your T-head. That's what I mean by wraps. Good question. Yeah, as far as them actually being static, that would be functional that you'd have to use JavaScript for. It's not by default. Okay, so here's one example of a pretty simple table. So we've got our table element. We've got our T-head, so I'm using an actual header here. We create a row, and then we've got two TDs, which are just normal cells. These could be THs because they are kind of headings. So if we wanted to use THs for these. So again, since we have two cells within this row, that's going to create two columns for us. So we see here we have two columns. We close our TR, we close our T-head. So again, that's what I mean by the T-head wrapping, the rows that are. You could have more than one row in here too if there were more than one row to your heading. Then we've got our T-body. Same deal. We've got a TR for the first row, two TDs, one for each column. Then we've got a second row to our column, or a second row to our body with, again, two elements, close our T-body and close our table. So again, the result, so the number of TDs that you have inside of a TR is how many columns you have. It's a little bit tricky to get your head around that at first, but once you kind of understand it, it makes sense. So you create, your table using the TRs with the number of TDs that you need for your column. So we've got two columns, and we've got three rows. The first one kind of being our header, and then our data. Any questions? Okay. Yeah, I'll kind of show some more examples later, I think, but tables are really useful, and I like to use tables for data that's tabular, right? So anything that makes sense to use a table. I'll use tables a lot for like schedules if a business has an hours of operation, and you can style it. You can remove the lines in between the grid lines and stuff like that. But it gives us a good layout. It allows us to do some, you could center or left align or right align based on whatever you need. You could use a table for like your shopping cart total. If you want to generate like a receipt or an invoice, you might use table for the line items on your receipt, something like that. It's really useful. So I'm not trying to scare you away from using tables, but only use tables when you have actual data that makes sense in a table. Don't try and kind of shoehorn other stuff into a table when it's not appropriate. Okay, let's talk about forms. Any questions about tables before we move on? Okay, so forms are used for user input. So anything where the user needs to provide some information, or the user needs to type something or choose some options, those are done via forms. So things like a search box is a form, a contact form, an order form, or like even login and register, a login form, those are all forms in the HTML. And there's several different types of form controls which allow different types of input. So we've got some input that are just text, so maybe a single line or a password or a text area, a box you can fill in. We've got choices, so there's radio buttons, checkboxes, etc. And then we've got submission, so an actual submit button, things like that. Forms will submit the information to a web server, which actually processes it. So kind of in the scope of this class, we won't really be able to look at the actual functionality of the form other than submitting it. But you have to have a web server, running some sort of code that's, configured to accept that form input and do something with it and then process a response back. But we're just going to look at the actual submission, so like the actual, area where the user can put in the input, and then, how we actually submit that to the web server. So, kind of the structure of our form. We use a form element, again, pretty self-explanatory, which wraps the entire form. There's a required attribute of action, which provides the URL that the form submits its information to. So wherever the form is supposed to submit the data to, that's what goes inside the action attribute. Forms can also be sent using one of two methods. So there's a get method and a post method. Get typically is used for retrieving information from the server. So anything where we're making a request, but we're saying I want to get some information from the server, that's going to be a get request. So things like search boxes typically will be get requests because there's a parameter, there's information you're sending, but ultimately you're requesting information, filtered by your parameter. But it's still a get. Get is also the default if no method attribute is provided. So the method attribute is optional, get being the default. But post is used to submit data to the server. So anytime you're sending data that needs to be saved or needs to be processed somehow, so like a registration form or an order form, things like that, where you're sending some information to the server and you're saying you need to do something with this, that's going to be a post request. So again, yeah, order form, contact form, things like that. So these are just kind of, some extra information. These are called HTTP verbs. There's some additional ones that are available, but these are kind of the main ones that we use with forms. Typically, too, if you were interacting with like an API or, some sort of, website integration that gives you the URL for your form, typically they will tell you what's expected. So usually the server that's accepting your request is configured for one or the other. It's either, and it usually tells you, like if it's an API, it'll say, submit a post request with these fields to this URL, something along those lines. So typically, you know which one of these you're supposed to use based on wherever you're submitting the form, because you process them differently on the server side. Okay, so input, also called form controls. So input is the HTML element used for quite a few different types of form controls. You'll notice it is an empty element, so there's no content inside of the element. It just is self-closing. The type attribute determines the type of input that it is. So again, input is kind of generic, and then we can use the type attribute to say what type of input it's supposed to be. So we'll go over examples of those here in a second. And then the name attribute is very important, and it gives a unique name to the input that identifies it when sent to the server. So name is the name of your input. So when the server sees your response, they'll see all of your inputs by name and value. So you might have a name of first name and a name of last name. So when the server gets that information, they'll see first name, Kraig, last name, Hufstedler. So yeah, name equals first name or name equals last name, something along those lines. So kind of looking at some different input types. So the most basic input we have is just type equals text. It creates a one-line text box. So it's kind of the most common. If it's like a username for a login form, something like that. Even a search box, usually it's just type text. It's just one line. The user you can say how many, limit the number of characters, but typically the user can type all they want, and it never gets a new line or anything. It's just a one-line box. Input type equals password creates a password box. Super important for a password, or even like a, oh, could you go? Mouse. Super important for a password, or even like a credit card number or something like that. You might use the password input for, because it obfuscates the input. So as you're typing, it doesn't show you each character. It shows you a little star instead, which is really handy. It's important if someone's looking over your shoulder. You don't want them to see your password. If you're sharing your screen, you have to type in your password. So you want to use input type of password for anything that is sensitive. Text area, which is different from the input element, can be used to create a multi-line text box. So something that allows more than one line of text, you would want to use a text area for. You notice text area is not self-closing. So if you use text area, you can put some content inside the text area element, which will be pre-filled with that content. So you can, say text area, your comments here, and then close your text area, and then your comments here will be pre-filled in that box. I don't usually like to pre-fill it this way. There's another way you can kind of put some placeholder text in that I don't know that we'll cover today, but there's another way of doing that. The annoying part about doing this is that the user has to select that text and delete it from the text box. And sometimes you'll put that there and people will forget to delete it or not notice that they need to delete it, and they'll add their text on top of what you pre-filled it. But it is a way to label or maybe provide a default message or something like that. Questions about input so far? Okay. Radio buttons. So input type equals radio. We'll create a radio button. So a radio button is usually like an on-off type thing, or maybe like a multiple choice box where only one can be selected. There's those little round selection buttons. The name attribute is used to group radio buttons together. So you can have multiple radio buttons which have the same name, and whichever one is selected is which value gets sent. So only one radio button in a group with the same name attribute can be selected. And then value indicates the value sent to the server if that option is selected. So, the radio button might be for say your gender. You can have a male and a female. And they would have the same name attribute, which is gender. And then the value of each radio button would be different based on what the selection is. And so whichever one is selected is the one that gets sent. Checked attribute can be used to pre-select a radio button. So if you want a default option to be selected, you can use checked to pre-select that. Show an example. I usually recommend doing checked equals checked. It doesn't really actually matter what the value of that checked attribute is, but I like to do checked equals checked as kind of a good standard practice. Show an example of this. Here we go. So here's an example of some radio buttons. So this would be like, choose your favorite genre of music, right? So you have 3 buttons, 3 options. They're all type radio. They all have the same name because it's kind of the same group. It's the same choice, right? So it's the same name, but they each have different values. So you have rock, pop, and jazz as your 3 different values, and only one of these can be selected because they all have the same name. And here, we can say rock is the default. So we do checked equals checked to indicate that this one should be selected when the page loads. So if the user never changes anything, that one will get sent to the server. So again, this checked attribute, it can be checked equals true or something. This value here doesn't actually matter. I think even in the new HTML specification, they've removed the value altogether. But I think that maybe some older browsers don't like that, and it kind of breaks things. So it's still recommended to do checked equals checked or something to indicate that should be checked. Technically, you can get away with just saying checked, but some older browsers and IE don't like attributes that don't have any value at all. So kind of supposed to fill that in with something. Okay, questions about radio buttons. that make sense? So anything that's multiple choice where more than one can't be selected is great for radio buttons. Our other kind of choice, or one of the other choice inputs is checkbox. So this creates a checkbox where multiple could be selected. They're not limited by one. So we use input type equals checkbox. Again, it's self-closing. The same thing. So we use the name attribute to group multiple checkboxes together. Unlike radio buttons, multiple checkboxes with the same name attribute can be selected. And then the value attribute indicates the value sent to the server if this checkbox is checked. So it still has a name and it still has a value. Unlike radio buttons, it doesn't restrict you to only selecting one with the same name. So you can have multiple, same name, and they could all be checked. Same thing, we use the checked attribute to indicate if it should be pre-checked when the page loads. So here's an example. So maybe the question is, what music service do you use? What's your favorite music service? We have input type checkbox, name is music service, we have a value of iTunes, here we have a value of Spotify, value of Google Play. You could have multiple ones, right? It's not a, multiple choice. Well, it is multiple choice, but they could all be selected if you use all of them. So, again, they could all be selected, none could be selected. This one by default will be checked with check equals check. You could also have this one be selected by default as well. You'll see this a lot with if you're subscribing to a newsletter or something, it'll say which newsletters do you want to get? Do you want to get our product newsletter? Do you want to get our news newsletter? And it might pre-select all of them by default. You have to go through and uncheck them all. That's checkboxes. Any questions? Okay. Okay, another option that we have for selections is a drop-down list. So we use select to create a drop-down, and then option elements inside the select provide the options that we have to choose from. Instead of checked, we use selected to pre-select an option on page load. So we can use selected equals selected we use that attribute on the option, say that option is selected. Yeah, have you have a question? Yeah, I'll show some examples after the lecture. Yep, good question. We can also do multiple as an attribute. We do that on the select, and that allows multiple selections. So usually, if it's not multiple, it's just a drop down, and you select one option. If multiple is added to the select, then it's just a box with options, and you can hold down Shift or something to select multiple things. So that's useful sometimes. So you might think of select your country or something like that as a drop down. Usually you can't have multiple countries, but I'm trying to think of an example where you would have multiple. Can't think of one off the top of my head. But anything where, maybe it's countries you've lived in, period. It can be multiple ones or something like that. Okay, so here's an example of a list. So we've got our select. Same deal, it has the select gets a name. So each option doesn't have a name attribute because the name goes along with the select attribute. So let's see, what is this? This is, if this was what device do you use to listen to music? So the name of our select is devices. Again, this one supports multiple, so that's okay. Multiple equals multiple. And then we've got three options. So they each have a value, which gets sent to the server if it's selected. We can use selected equals selected to say that iPod is the default. That should be selected by default. Sometimes you will add none or something like that and make that the default if it's a optional select. If someone could choose none of the above or something like that. So a lot of times you will see an extra option that might be selected by default that just says none or no choice or something like that. And then we've got our multiple options here with different values based on what they are. One important thing too to mention is the value should not have any spaces in it. Same with the name. Servers don't do very good managing It'll be kind of encoded by default if you do, but generally it's best to keep this what we call machine readable, which is just going to be, typically you just want lowercase letters, maybe a dash or an underscore, but you want it to be a little more simple, whereas your actual label here, so this is the part that the user actually sees. So you can say a mobile device and you can capitalize it and have spaces and everything, it's fine. But in your actual value, you want to keep it pretty simple and no spaces or capitals, just to keep it easier for the server to read. Because this is the value the server is going to see. The server doesn't care what you have here. This is just the label that the user sees. This is what's important and what gets sent with your data. Any questions about lists so far? Cool. And again, I'll show you some examples of what these look like in a minute. I need to find where's the nearest power outlet to right here?
Don't think there is one.
Okay. Battery's about to die. It's not really set up for lecturing. Okay, awesome. Here now. Okay, that's lists. Another type of input that we might use is the file input type. So this is used for any sort of upload field. So I've used this quite a bit. Anything where the user is uploading their profile photo or uploading an attachment or something like that, you would use the file input type to do that. The behavior is a little bit different in each browser. I'll show an example of that, but typically it provides like a browse button, which will open a file explorer window to where the user can select a file from their computer. So by default, it'll just have a button that says browse, and you can click that and it lets you choose your file. Does this actually work? It's not charging. Okay, good. Now we're charging. Okay, so input type file, upload a file. Usually I don't know if you've seen the functionality where you can kind of drag a file to an area or drag a file to, the file dialog to start the upload. That's functionality that the browser provides for that input type. So usually if you use input type file, you get that drag and drop functionality by default. Submit button. So important part of our form is actually submitting the form, right? We need the user to actually be able to click a button to submit. So we use input type equals submit, which will create a button that submits the form. The name attribute is optional. It doesn't really matter what the name is. But the value attribute will provide the text that shows up on the submit button. So you notice it's self-closing, but we can use value to say what the submit action is. So, maybe it's a message form or something like that. We could use input type equals submit and then value equals send message. And then that value is what actually gets displayed on the button. Another option is an image button. So, by default, the buttons, I'll show you what a default one looks like. But you know what they look like. They're kind of boring, just a really simple button. If you want kind of a more interesting submit button, you could use input type equals image, which will replace the submit button with your own custom image. So if you want something that looks more interesting, It uses the normal image attribute, so it's very similar to just using the image element. So you can provide the source. You probably want to provide an alt that might be submit button or something like that, just in case your image doesn't load. The user can still see what it is. You can even use height and width as well. So here's an example. Image type equals image. You give it a source, and then you use the alt to provide, kind of your backup text. Questions? Okay. Hidden inputs are also important and really useful. So you can use input type equals hidden to create form controls that will not be shown on the page. It might not be really apparent at the outset what you would use that for, but it's actually incredibly useful. Maybe not in the scope of this class, but anytime that you want some information to be included on the form that the user doesn't necessarily need to see, you would use the hidden input to do that. So a lot of times we'll put a timestamp on a form if you want to submit the time that the user submits something. And you could do that with JavaScript. You could have an hidden input and then update it when they submit by adding the timestamp. Might be some sort of calculated fields like a subtotal or a total, something like that, where the user doesn't necessarily need to see that as part of the submission. It's not something they can edit or change, but it's calculated. So, maybe you have a form where they can select some radio buttons and use some JavaScript to calculate a total or calculate some value that you would insert into that hidden field when they submit it. Something like a user ID, again, where the user doesn't need to see it, but you have that information, you want it to submit along with the form, use input of type hidden to do that. It can be seen by viewing the page source. So if the user, pulls up the inspector or does view source, they can see those hidden inputs. So they're not really like secure. So you wouldn't want to use it for any sensitive information or anything that should be private, like a password or something like that. That's kind of an older anti-pattern that some people got caught doing, is by using input type hidden to kind of pre-fill the user's password or something like that if it was like a form that required some authentication. So you don't want to do that because it's really easy for the users to see that. So again, we won't really use this much in this class, but it's good to know that that exists, that you can add stuff to the form that the user doesn't get to see. It's actually really, really useful. We use this a lot too. There's a security feature called CSRF, or cross-site request forgery, where you can, from one website submit a form that goes to another website. So say, if you're on my page, craighh.com, I could include some form, and then I can put the URL whatever I want. So I could have the URL to my form be facebook.com, and like maybe the form is like send me a message, but what the form really does is post to your Facebook wall. And if you have another tab open that has Facebook loaded and you're logged in, your browser has your Facebook login credentials and your cookies, already saved. So I could, in theory, submit a request to Facebook instead of, whatever. So the way to fix that is that Facebook will put a token in every form field that's secret that my website can never know. So I can never submit a request to Facebook on your behalf because I don't have your secret token. So Facebook those tokens are usually generated every page load, and they're unique to that date and time in that user. But the user doesn't need to see those, so they're included in every form with a hidden input. There'll be the CSRF token. It'll have this big, long, cryptographic token in it. But the user doesn't ever see it. It's just kind of on each page by default, and it's a security feature. So those are things we would use hidden inputs for. Okay, form labels. So we have our form, but we want to show the user what each input is for. Pretty important. So the label element is used to create a label for a form control. They can be associated with the input in one of two ways, and they're both valid. You can either place the input element inside the label element. This is kind of my preferred way of doing it. So you can have your label, and you have like first name, and then you have your input, type equals text, and then you close your label. So the input is nested inside the label. I find that to be a little bit more clear. It's a little more obvious what input the label goes with. It's even clear just in your HTML. Usually I'll, put the input on a new line and indent it, so it's pretty clear. However, there's some limitations here, especially display. So if you want to move things around a little bit, you can sometimes be limited by the fact that your input is a child of your label. That can cause you some issues. So the other way to do it is to use the for attribute, which responds to the ID attribute of a form control. So you've got your label, use the for attribute, and you provide the ID, so first name, then you've got your label, first name, and then on your input, which can be anywhere else in your HTML, you have your name, but then you have your ID element, or your ID attribute, with first name, and this ID and this for need to match for them to be related. So this is another way to do it. This gives you a little more flexibility because these can be anywhere in your HTML. So maybe you have like a column layout and you want your labels on one side, you want inputs on the other side, something like that. This gives you a lot more flexibility to do it. Any idea why it's important that our labels are tied to the proper inputs through our HTML and not just visually? Any idea? Screen readers are one of the biggest reasons. So screen readers, they need to know what the label for an input is. And you can have a label and input right next to each other, but the screen reader doesn't necessarily read visually in order. It reads through your HTML in order. So it's really, really important for screen readers that the labels are directly tied to the inputs in your actual HTML and not just visually near each other. So again, doing it this way, the screen reader would label first name and then the input, or this way, different screen readers do it differently. Some of them will just read that it's the label, and then sometimes they'll read the label and then they'll read the input kind of no matter where they are. Or sometimes it'll ignore the label until it gets to the input, and then it'll say, input label is first name, no matter where this is in the HTML. But these can be separated in the HTML, but the screen reader will read them together. It'll know that they're associated. So if you have all of your labels first and then all of your inputs, it'll actually read the label associated with the input because of the way you've tied them together. It's also important, sometimes in some browsers you can click on a label and it'll put your cursor inside the input for you, or you could click on a label for like a checkbox, and sometimes it'll actually check the box just from clicking on the label, so you don't have to click the actual checkbox. So that's also an important part of it as well. Label location is important. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into layout stuff and some design principles, but it should be pretty obvious which input corresponds to the label. So usually you want the label either above or to the left of the input. Checkboxes and radio buttons are a little bit different sometimes. Sometimes you want it to the right. Sometimes you want it to the left, though. It just kind of depends. But so just make sure, again, we'll get into more of this when we talk about styling and positioning, but you need to make sure that your labels are tied to your inputs visually in a logical way. You don't want the user to get confused. That's annoying. I've dealt with that somewhere. It's not super clear what the inputs are. Sometimes you'll put, email where you're supposed to put name or something like that, and then when you submit the form, you get an error because you did it wrong. It's actually pretty common. So pretty important that you have your label tied to your inputs. Okay, grouping form elements. So there's an element called field set, which can be used to group form controls together. So this is really useful for longer forms that maybe have separate sections. We can break them up a little bit by using field sets to create groups of inputs. So it'll kind of group the form controls together. We can use legend immediately after the opening field set to give our field set a caption. So legend will kind of label a field set. So here's an example. We might have field set, then we've got legend, contact me, and then we've got our label and our inputs, and then we would close our field set. So again, that's useful for longer forms. Maybe if it's registration, like a registration form, you might have like a, login info which is like your username and your password. You might have a personal info, which is like your name and your email and your phone number. You might have, preferences, which is some options you can select on registration. Those are all kind of separate sections of that same form. You can use field set to kind of break those apart. It's nice. By default, it kind of like draws a box around them, and it'll put the field set kind of at the top in your kind of throughout the border. So I'll show an example of that here in a second. There's some new form features that we have with HTML5 now, which I'm pretty sure all of these are fully supported, at least through IE9 or so. So these options you can all pretty much use without worrying too much about your browser compatibility. But you can do some form validation now. So you can identify a field as required using the required attribute. This is a huge lifesaver because before this, you had to do all of your validation maybe in JavaScript, which isn't really as reliable because the user can change it, or on the server side and then show an error when they get back, after they've missed an input or something. So having a native way of saying which form fields are required is super, super useful. Saves us from writing a lot of JavaScript. So password usually is a required element. So you can say required equals required, and the browser will then force the user to fill in that input before they can submit the form. And again, it's nice because each browser handles a little bit differently, but usually if you skip it or something, it'll outline it in red if you try and submit without filling out that form input. So it's really nice, and it won't let you click the submit button usually unless you filled it out. So really nice way to create required inputs. There's also an input of type equals date. Other older browsers like IE8 and 9 will just show as a text box that the user just has to type a date in. But newer browsers will actually show a date picker. So it'll have a button where you can click and it'll pop up a calendar. You can select a date on the calendar and then it'll fill it in for you. Really, really nice because you can't always trust users to put in the right format if it's just a text box. Some people might use dashes, some people might use slashes, some people might use the American format of day, month, year, or month, day, year. Some people might use the more international day, month, year. But by using the date input type, it's going to be standard every time because the user just picks it on a date and then it fills in the data for you. There's also an email input type now, which will verify proper email address format. Again, super useful. It'll actually check to make sure it's a valid email before it lets you submit. You can also have an input type of URL, which validates that it's a correct URL. One nice feature, too, is most mobile phones will actually change the mobile keyboard a bit when you're using these input types. So I don't know if you've noticed, but sometimes when you're filling in an email field for a URL field on your phone, the keyboard will add like a .com and a .net and like an @ sign and stuff like that to the bottom of the keyboard or something. That's because of these input types. So there's also a number one now. I don't think I have it on the slide, but there's a number input type in the keyboard for your phone. Usually will just show a number pad now, which is really, really nice. So you can kind of, the phones will tailor the input to whatever type it is. There's also a search input type, which by default is styled a little bit differently. It's rounded, whereas most inputs by default are kind of rectangular. It has a clear button in most browsers, so you can type in a search field, and usually you're doing some sort of AJAX or filtering. But then say the user just wants to clear the input, there will be a little clear button they can click to delete the input. Sometimes is useful. Also new in HTML5, I mentioned this earlier, but there's a placeholder attribute, which can be used to add background text to any field. So, if you have a, input type of email, you can use the placeholder equals, and then you could say like example@example.com as your placeholder. What's nice about that is it shows up kind of in a little bit of faded text in the input, but once the user clicks on the input, the placeholder disappears. So they don't have to manually select that pre-filled option and delete it. It just disappears once they've clicked their cursor into the input. So really, really nice to use a placeholder. Okay, questions about these form inputs? There's some more, I think, too, and they're always adding new ones. So I probably need to update this slide with the number 1. I think there's even a phone input now that will validate that it's a phone number, which is nice, and even kind of do some default formatting for you. Okay, let me pull up some examples real quick over here. And kind of show you what these forms can look like. Hey, Shrikar, do you mind click on the mouse for me? CodePen, by the way, CodePen.io is a really nice tool. I'll use this some for demos like this, but it lets you write some HTML and some JavaScript and CSS just in your browser, and it'll render it for you. So it's a super useful tool. So really useful for kind of, if you don't necessarily want to work on a full page, you don't want to deal with, Atom and that kind of thing, you can use this to kind of do some quick messing around with things. It's also nice because you can share it with other people, so it's very useful. Let's see. Let's see, I'll show this too, just since we didn't get to it the other day. So this is kind of going back to text elements a little bit, just to show you kind of what those look like by default. So a little bit, I'll also like to do this one. So this is kind of what the your headings look like by default. So we've got our 6 levels of headings. As you can see, the font size just decreases. They're all kind of bold and stand out a little bit, but heading 6 being the smallest. We've got our paragraphs. You can see like I can take all this empty space here and put this paragraph on the same line as the other one. But you'll see they still get a new line in between them and a little bit of spacing. So again, that's really nice. The headings would be the same way. So I can take this heading 2 and put it on the same line as the heading 1. Same with the heading 3. HTML doesn't care. It doesn't matter what your spacing is like on your file. It's going to display it correctly. I'll link you to this. I'll maybe just post the link on Blackboard. Show some examples of using like subscript and superscript. Here's what our horizontal line looks like, our horizontal rule. It's just kind of a light gray line. Yeah, this just kind of shows the default styling. Here's our list. So here's an ordered list, an unordered list, and this is what a definition list looks like. So that's nice. Okay, pull up table demo. So this is an example of a table. So we've got a couple of different tables here. So class attendance, we've just got our table. We've got our table row. Sometimes you want your top left cell to be empty, especially if you have headings both on the top row and the top column. So in this case, we've got our headings across the top, which is the day, but then we also want a heading down the left in the first column, which is the week 1, week 2, week 3. So usually when you have that type of table, your first cell is empty. You don't want anything up there, so we've got just an empty TD here for our very first cell. It's just empty because there's nothing that is really needed in there. So we've got our THs for our headings. So again, they're bold and they're centered by default. You'll notice this, the numbers are left aligned, but the headings are centered. And then, let's see, here's an example of using call span. So if we had a class schedule where, maybe a class could span multiple hours or something, we can use call span equals 2 to say that this TD should span more than one column. It should span 2 columns. So then we see here geography takes up those 2 columns. Kind of a nice feature. Same for science here. We've had it span all 3. So you notice like this first one has 5 columns, right? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. So we've got 5 THs in this case because they're headings. However, this one we only need 4, and that's because of the call span. If we didn't have call span equals 2 in here, if we took that out, notice how it changes. It changes the display to make some more space, but we've just got our 1, 2, 3, 4, and it leaves this last one empty. So the call span is what pushes these over so that all of the columns are filled. So put that back. Here's an example of where we would use like T-head. So we've got T-head for our heading, which in this case is like a student and the grade. Then we've got our T-body, which has each student in it. So again, this T-body could be super long, and maybe we want to limit its height and allow it to scroll rather than just displaying hundreds of results on the page. But then we've got our T-foot that contains the average. So again, we might always want to see the heading and the footer, but allow the content in between to scroll. We would have to use the T-head and the T-foot for that. Any questions about tables? I'll link this in Blackboard as well, so you can look at it if you want to mess around. Let's see. So let's look at forms before we wrap up. So here's an example of a form. So we've got a heading. This is what our field set looks like. So we've got a user info field set, and we've got a payment info field set. It's a common use of field set, and you see the legend is just kind of shown within that top heading. Excuse me. We've got an email field that has type email. So if you notice, this is Firefox. If we just type something random and tab, to the next one, it's already showing us red because it needs to be, an actual email address. And likely, if we try to submit, it's telling us please enter an email address. So it's really nice. It's gonna be a little bit different, I think, in Chrome. I'll show you what that looks like. Load. So in Chrome, so Chrome doesn't change it to red, from tabbing away, but if we click submit, it's still going to pop up and tell us that it needs to be valid. It actually provides us a little more information by saying it needs to include an @ so it's telling us what's wrong with it. That's kind of nice. Rather than just saying, please enter a valid email, it's actually saying what's wrong. So again, this is a good example of 2 different ways. Firefox, I kind of prefer Firefox because it just shows it red, so you can kind of see, okay, there's a problem there while you're still filling out the form. It's actually a bit nicer. I like to really immediately get that feedback, whereas Chrome doesn't do that. I was going to open Safari and see what it does. So again, these are the kind of examples of where the browsers kind of interpret a little bit differently, how that function should look. Wonder what Safari does. Loaded a little quicker than Chrome for one thing. So if we just type something random in here. Yeah, so one, it's giving us this autofill, which is kind of nice. That's another benefit of using, like the email type, is that browsers that have autofill functionality will, kind of provide you with the ability to autofill. Let's see if we submit. Yeah, so it just pops up and says enter an email address. So again, these all look a little bit different, but they all provide that same functionality. Let's see here. So we've got name, subscribe to newsletter. So this is a checkbox. So this one just has, one option. We could, if we wanted to, add, another. Well, let's add a radio button real quick, just so we can see what that looks like. So let's say label. Let's say newsletter frequency. This could also be a, select name equals frequency, and we'll say value equals weekly. And then we could have another value monthly. Important thing to note too with radio buttons, same with checkboxes, you do, and in fact, you do have to provide the value in text. So we could say weekly, and we can say monthly. And we can clean this up a little bit. We could add a break tag in there just to pop down to a new line. But so here we see the difference between, the checkbox is just a square checkbox like this. The radio buttons are circular, and it only lets us select one, or at least it should. I've done something wrong here. Why does it let me choose more than one? I'm not sure. I had something wrong here. Anyway, you get the idea of what it looks like when it's different for a radio button versus a checkbox. Let's see, here's a placeholder. So we've made our credit card box required, and we've used placeholder to provide the format that the user should put the info in. So that's a really useful way of placeholder, because there's multiple ways you could do, 1, 2, 3, 4 dash 1, 2, 3, 4. But here we're indicating that it should just be 1, 2, 3, 4 space 1, 2, 3, 4. And you notice once you start typing anything, the placeholder text disappears. So that's really nice. Here's an example of date as well. So once you click on it, it drops down a calendar for you. You can select it, pre-fills the correct format for you, which is nice. I think that's about it. We've got our submit button with value, submit order. So that's what provides the text for the submit button. Okay, like I said, I'll put these links. I think I have one more that shows all of the possible form inputs as well. I don't know where that went. But anyway, I'll link those on Blackboard so you can take a look at them and play around. If you're in CodePen, if you click on, you probably have to log in, create an account, but if you click on fork up here on the top right, it will create your own copy of it. So if you're going to mess around with it, click that fork button, and then it'll let you edit your own version. It'll kind of copy it into your own account, so then you can play around with it. So I don't think it'll let you fork button, then you'll get an editable version. Okay, if you have any questions, let me know on Slack, or I'll stick around for a few minutes. And other than that, have a good rest of your Tuesday. Let's go. Yeah, sweet.